In the summer of 1957, a quiet artist living in Brooklyn was arrested by the FBI. He painted landscapes in soft watercolors, collected vintage stamps from around the world, and spoke with a gentle European accent that his neighbors found charming. His name was Emil Goldfus, and he was the kind of man you could pass on the street 1,000 times without ever noticing him. He wore simple clothes, cardigan sweaters, wrinkled slacks, thick framed glasses that magnified his tired eyes. He smiled politely at the grocer, paid his rent on time, and never caused trouble. But when federal agents broke down his door on the morning of June 21, 1957, they discovered something that would shake the foundations of American intelligence. Emil Goldfus did not exist. The man they arrested was Colonel Rudolf Abel, the Soviet Union's most dangerous spy, and he had been living a complete lie for nearly a decade. Every conversation, every painting, every cup of coffee at the corner diner, all of it was performance, a role so perfectly executed that even those who knew him best never suspected the truth. Before we begin, subscribe to uncover the stories they buried in classified files, and make sure no name stays forgotten in the shadows of history. The morning of June 21, 1957, began like any other in Brooklyn's Park Slope neighborhood. The sun rose over brownstone apartments, casting long shadows across quiet streets still damp from the previous night's rain. Residents shuffled to corner delis for coffee and newspapers. Children played stickball in narrow alleyways. Pigeons cooed on fire escapes. And in a modest fourth-floor studio at 252 Fulton Street, a man sat at his wooden easel, paintbrush in hand, carefully capturing the soft morning light filtering through his dusty window. His name, or so everyone believed, was Emil R. Goldfus. He was in his mid-50s, balding, with thick black-rimmed glasses and a calm, methodical demeanor that made him nearly invisible in the bustling chaos of post-war New York City. He spoke English fluently, but with a slight accent. German, perhaps, or possibly Austrian. No one asked too many questions. This was Brooklyn in the 1950s, a melting pot where accents were as common as fire escapes and where a man's past was his own business. Goldfus made his living as a photographer's assistant, developing film in cramped darkrooms and setting up lights for portrait sessions. But his true passion, he told anyone who asked, was art. He rented a small studio space at the Ovington Building on Fulton Street, where he spent hours painting landscapes and still lifes. His work was competent, careful, technically proficient, but never extraordinary. He attended art classes at the Brooklyn Museum on weekends. He joined a local camera club where hobbyists gathered to critique each other's work. He drank coffee at the same Greek diner every Tuesday morning, always ordering eggs over easy with wheat toast and black coffee, no sugar. He had friends, or at least friendly acquaintances. Bert Silverman, a young painter, knew him from the art studio they shared. Oh, Silverman found Goldfus pleasant, intelligent, interested in discussing technique and composition. They sometimes ate lunch together, sandwiches from the deli downstairs. Goldfus never talked about family, never mentioned a wife or children, never spoke of his past before arriving in New York. When asked, he'd offer vague references to difficult times in Europe and quickly change the subject. He was, by all appearances, profoundly ordinary, forgettable, harmless. And that was precisely the point. What his neighbors didn't know, what no one knew, was that Emil Goldfus was a fabrication, a carefully constructed identity built layer by layer, lie by lie, over the course of years until it became indistinguishable from reality. The man behind the mask was Colonel Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer who had been operating on American soil since 1948, directing a network of spies that penetrated some of the nation's most sensitive military and scientific institutions. But even that name, Rudolf Abel, was a lie. His real identity remains one of the Cold War's most enduring mysteries. The man who would become Rudolf Abel entered the United States on November 17, 1948, though the exact details of his arrival remain classified even today. What is known is this: he crossed into the country illegally, likely through Canada, carrying forged documents and multiple identities. He was already a veteran intelligence officer, trained by the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, in the dark arts of espionage, coded communications, dead drops, surveillance detection, identity construction. His orders were clear: establish a network of agents within the United States, gather intelligence on American military capabilities, nuclear research, and government communications, and remain undetected for as long as possible. The Cold War was entering its most dangerous phase. The Soviet Union had just detonated its first atomic bomb, shocking American officials who believed they had years before Moscow would achieve nuclear capability. The race for technological and military supremacy was accelerating, and intelligence, human intelligence, gathered on the ground by operatives like Abel, was worth more than gold. Abel's first task was to disappear, not into hiding, but into plain sight. He needed a cover identity so solid, so mundane, that no one would ever think to question it. He spent months researching, planning, rehearsing. He studied American culture, practiced his English accent, memorized baseball scores and radio shows. He learned to blend in, to become American without ever forgetting who he truly served. He chose the name Emil Goldfus, borrowed from a real person who had died years earlier, whose death certificate had never been properly filed. Abel obtained a forged birth certificate, fabricated employment records, and created a paper trail that stretched back just far enough to seem legitimate, but not so far that it invited deep scrutiny. He rented his first apartment in Manhattan, then moved to Brooklyn, settling into the anonymous sprawl of working-class neighborhoods where no one cared who you were as long as you paid your rent. He worked odd jobs: dishwasher, handyman, photo lab assistant. He saved money. He built relationships, slowly, carefully, never revealing too much, never drawing attention. He became Emil Goldfus, the quiet European immigrant trying to make a life in America. And once that identity was solid, once it felt real even to him, he began his true work. By 1950, Abel was operational. He had established contact with Moscow through a complex system of coded radio transmissions, receiving orders and sending reports using shortwave frequencies that changed weekly. He communicated using one-time pads, encryption keys that could only be used once and then destroyed, making the messages virtually unbreakable even if intercepted. He recruited agents, though many of them never knew they were working for Soviet intelligence. Some were ideological sympathizers, Americans who believed in communism and were willing to betray their country for what they saw as a greater cause. Others were more pragmatic: scientists, engineers, military personnel who provided information in exchange for money. Abel was a master at identifying vulnerabilities: debt, anger, ideology, ambition. He knew how to approach people, how to make them feel understood, valued, needed. His network gathered intelligence on military installations, weapons development, and most critically, America's nuclear program. The information flowed through Abel's hands and across the Atlantic to Moscow, where Soviet planners used it to accelerate their own weapons development and anticipate American military strategy. But Abel's greatest strength was his caution. He operated with a level of discipline that was almost pathological. He never met agents in public unless absolutely necessary. He never used the telephone for sensitive communications. He employed an elaborate system of dead drops, hiding places where messages and materials could be left and retrieved without the parties ever meeting face to face. A hollow bolt in a public park, a magnetized container hidden beneath a bridge, a false electrical outlet in a subway station. He stored nothing incriminating in his apartment. His studio at the Ovington building became his operations center, but even there, he maintained layers of security. Code books were hidden inside hollowed-out blocks of wood. Microfilm was concealed in cufflinks and pencils. If someone searched the studio, they would find nothing but art supplies and photography equipment. For years, it worked. Abel operated in complete anonymity, a ghost moving through American society, gathering secrets and sending them home. The FBI suspected Soviet intelligence was active in the United States. They had broken several smaller networks, but Abel remained untouchable, unknown, invisible, until Reino Heihanen arrived. Reino Heihanen was everything Rudolf Abel was not. Where Abel was disciplined, Heihanen was reckless. Where Abel was cautious, Heihanen was impulsive. Where Abel blended into American life, Heihanen stood out like a sore thumb. Overweight, alcoholic, paranoid, and increasingly unstable. Heihanen had been sent to New York in 1952 to serve as Abel's assistant, a liaison who would handle some of the network's more mundane tasks and allow Abel to focus on high-level operations. But from the beginning, Heihanen was a disaster. He drank heavily, often showing up drunk to meetings. He was careless with security protocols, leaving materials unsecured and using his real name in situations where he should have maintained cover. He spent money recklessly, drawing attention to himself. Abel tried to manage him, to salvage the situation, but Heihanen was beyond control. By 1957, it was clear he had become a catastrophic liability. Abel sent a coded message to Moscow. Heihanen needed to be recalled. Moscow agreed. Orders were issued. Heihanen was told to return to the Soviet Union for reassignment, but Heihanen was not stupid. He knew what reassignment often meant in the world of Soviet intelligence. Operatives who failed, who became liabilities, did not retire peacefully. They disappeared. He had heard the stories. Agents recalled to Moscow, never seen again. Their families told they had died in accidents or been reassigned to remote posts. He suspected his recall was not about reassignment. It was about elimination. So, in May 1957, instead of boarding a flight to Moscow, Reino Heihanen walked into the American embassy in Paris and uttered the words that would unravel Rudolf Abel's entire operation. "I am a Soviet spy, and I want to defect." American intelligence officers were initially skeptical. Defectors were not uncommon during the Cold War, but many were cranks, con artists, or mentally unstable individuals looking for attention or asylum. Heihanen looked like all three. He was disheveled, nervous, clearly alcoholic. His story sounded almost too dramatic to be true. But as they debriefed him over the following days, it became clear that Heihanen was exactly what he claimed to be. He knew too much: operational details, coded communication protocols, names of dead drop locations. He described the inner workings of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States with a level of specificity that could only come from direct involvement. He told them about Mark, his superior officer, the man who ran the network, a disciplined and cautious operative who lived somewhere in Brooklyn. Heihanen didn't know Mark's real name. He had only met him a handful of times, always in carefully controlled circumstances, but he remembered details. Mark worked in photography. He was in his 50s. He lived near a subway station. He spoke perfect English with a slight accent. Most importantly, Heihanen had visited Mark's studio once, years earlier, to pick up instructions. He thought he could find it again. The FBI moved quickly. This was the break they had been waiting for, a chance to penetrate Soviet intelligence operations at the highest level. They brought Heihanen to New York and began the painstaking process of retracing his steps. For days, they drove him through Brooklyn, past camera shops and art studios, looking for anything that sparked recognition. Then, on June 13, 1957, Heihanen pointed to a building on Fulton Street. "This is it," he said. "This is where Mark works." The FBI confirmed the building housed several small studios and businesses. They identified the tenants, cross-referenced them against immigration records and employment histories, and began surveillance. They photographed everyone entering and leaving. They noted routines, patterns, behaviors. And slowly, they focused on one man. Emil R. Goldfus, fourth-floor studio, photographer's assistant and amateur painter. A quiet, unremarkable man who seemed to have no past before 1948. The FBI requested permission for a search. On June 21, 1957, they made their move. FBI Special Agent Ed Gamber knocked on the door of Studio 505 at precisely 7:15 a.m. Inside, Rudolf Abel was already awake, sitting at his easel, working on a landscape painting of Central Park in autumn. He had been expecting this moment for days, perhaps longer. He had noticed the surveillance. Cars parked too long on the street, the same faces appearing too often in the neighborhood. He was too experienced not to recognize the signs. When the knock came, he set down his brush, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked calmly to the door. He opened it without hesitation. Gamber held up his badge. "Mr. Goldfus, I'm with the FBI. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Abel looked at the badge, then at the three other agents standing behind Gamber in the narrow hallway. He smiled faintly. "Of course," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. "Please, come in." The agents entered the studio and began their search. Abel sat quietly in a wooden chair, hands folded in his lap, watching them work. He did not resist. He did not protest. He simply waited, his expression neutral, almost serene. It took less than an hour to find the first piece of evidence. Hidden inside a hollowed-out block of wood disguised as a paperweight was a 250-page codebook filled with cipher keys and communication protocols. Inside a shaving kit tucked into a drawer, they discovered sheets of microfilm, each one containing thousands of coded messages. A false electrical outlet concealed documents written in Russian, detailing intelligence reports on American military installations. A hollow pencil contained tightly rolled instructions for dead drop locations throughout New York City. The studio was a masterpiece of concealment. Every ordinary object had a secret purpose. A block of wood was a safe. A pencil was a courier. A coin was a message capsule. But the most chilling discovery was what they didn't find: any evidence of Emil Goldfus's past. No birth certificate, no school records, no letters from family, no photographs. The identity was a shell, expertly crafted and meticulously maintained, but ultimately hollow. Gamber turned to Abel. "Mr. Goldfus, you are under arrest on suspicion of espionage against the United States." Abel nodded slowly. He stood without being asked, turned around, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. As they led him out of the studio, past his unfinished paintings and his neatly arranged art supplies, he looked back once, briefly, as if memorizing the scene. Then he walked calmly down the stairs and into the waiting car. He never spoke Emil Goldfus's name again. For weeks, FBI interrogators tried to break Rudolf Abel. They used every technique in their arsenal: good cop, bad cop, psychological pressure, isolation, sleep deprivation. They showed him the evidence. They told him about Heihanen's defection. They offered him deals, cooperation in exchange for leniency, immunity for his network in exchange for information about Soviet operations. Abel listened politely. He answered some questions, deflected others, and remained utterly calm. He admitted nothing of substance. He confirmed his real name was not Emil Goldfus, but refused to provide his true identity. When asked about his network, he smiled faintly and said, "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." His composure was unnerving. Most captured spies cracked under pressure, some quickly, some slowly, but almost all eventually broke. Abel never did. He treated the interrogations like polite conversations, answering questions about art and photography while deflecting anything related to espionage. The FBI realized they were dealing with a professional unlike any they had encountered before. This was not an ideological amateur or a mercenary motivated by money. This was a career intelligence officer, trained to resist interrogation, conditioned to accept capture as an occupational hazard. In October 1957, Rudolf Abel was put on trial in federal court in Brooklyn. The case attracted massive media attention. Newspapers ran headlines about the master spy and the red ghost of Brooklyn. Photographers crowded the courthouse steps. Spectators lined up for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had fooled America for nearly a decade. The trial was, in many ways, a foregone conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The code books, the microfilm, the false identities, all of it pointed to one undeniable fact. Rudolf Abel was a Soviet spy who had operated illegally on American soil for years. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, exhibit by exhibit, witness by witness. But Abel's defense, led by a lawyer named James Donovan, was not about proving innocence. It was about preserving Abel's dignity and protecting his rights under American law. Donovan argued that Abel, whatever his crimes, deserved a fair trial and competent representation. He challenged the legality of the search, questioned the reliability of Heihanen's testimony, and insisted that even enemy spies were entitled to due process. The judge and jury were not swayed. On October 25, 1957, Rudolf Abel was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. As the verdict was read, Abel stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back. He showed no emotion, no anger, no fear, no relief. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a move in a chess game he had known he would lose. But the story was far from over. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet airspace. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survived and was captured by Soviet forces. His mission, photographing Soviet military installations from high altitude, was exposed, causing an international crisis and deeply embarrassing the United States government. Powers was put on trial in Moscow, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But behind the scenes, both American and Soviet officials recognized an opportunity. They had each other's spies. A trade was possible. Negotiations were conducted in secret through intermediaries. The Soviets wanted Rudolf Abel back. He was a hero in Moscow, a symbol of Soviet intelligence prowess. The Americans wanted Powers back, both to end his captivity and to prevent him from revealing classified information under prolonged interrogation. James Donovan, Abel's defense attorney, was recruited to negotiate the exchange. Over the course of months, he traveled between Washington and East Berlin, meeting with Soviet officials, navigating legal complexities, and building trust with both sides. Finally, on February 10, 1962, the exchange was set. The location, Glienicke Bridge, a narrow span connecting West Berlin to Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge had become known as the Bridge of Spies, a Cold War checkpoint where East and West occasionally traded captured agents. It was a cold morning, gray and overcast. Abel was brought to the bridge by American officials. He wore a long coat and a hat, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. On the other side of the bridge, Francis Gary Powers waited, flanked by Soviet guards. At precisely 8:20 a.m., the two men began walking toward each other across the bridge. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured. Halfway across, they passed without a word, without acknowledgement. Powers continued toward the west. Abel continued toward the east. As Abel reached the Soviet side, he turned briefly and looked back at the American officials standing in the cold morning light. He gave a slight nod, acknowledgement perhaps, or farewell. Then he turned and walked into the waiting car, disappearing behind the Iron Curtain. He was home. Rudolf Abel returned to Moscow as a hero. He was awarded the Order of Lenin, the Soviet Union's highest honor. He was given a comfortable apartment, a pension, and the respect due to a man who had served his country with distinction. But he did not give interviews. He did not write memoirs. He did not boast about his accomplishments. He simply lived quietly, spending his days painting and reading, much as he had in Brooklyn. He remained what he had always been: disciplined, cautious, invisible. Western intelligence agencies tried to learn more about him. Who was he, really? Where had he been trained? What other operations had he run? But Abel took his secrets with him. He never spoke publicly about his work. He never confirmed or denied the details of his network. He never revealed his true name. In 1971, Rudolf Abel died of lung cancer in Moscow. He was 68 years old. He was buried with military honors in Donskoy Cemetery, a resting place for Soviet heroes. His gravestone bore the name Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, though even that may not have been his real identity. Years later, researchers pieced together fragments of his past. They believe he was born William Genrikhovich Fischer in 1903, the son of Russian émigrés living in England. His parents were revolutionaries who returned to the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution. Fischer, if that was truly his name, joined Soviet intelligence in his 20s and spent decades working in Europe and North America. But certainty remains elusive. The Soviet archives have never fully opened. The documents that might confirm his identity remain classified. Even today, more than 50 years after his death, Rudolf Abel remains a ghost, a man defined not by who he was, but by what he became. The case of Rudolf Abel remains one of the most significant espionage stories of the Cold War, not because of the intelligence he gathered, though that was substantial, but because of what it revealed about the nature of identity, loyalty, and deception. Abel's success was built on a simple but terrifying premise. A person can become someone else so completely that even they begin to forget where the mask ends and the real self begins. For nearly 10 years, he lived as Emil Goldfus, painting pictures and drinking coffee, while secretly serving a foreign power. He was so convincing, so thoroughly immersed in his fabricated life, that even those who knew him best never suspected the truth. His story raises questions that go beyond espionage. How well do we really know the people around us? How much of identity is performance? What does it mean to live a lie so perfectly that it becomes indistinguishable from truth? James Donovan, the lawyer who defended Abel and negotiated his exchange, later wrote that Abel was one of the most remarkable men he had ever met. Intelligent, cultured, principled in his own way. Donovan came to respect him, even admire him, despite the fact that Abel had worked to undermine everything Donovan believed in. Bert Silverman, the young painter who had shared a studio with Abel, was devastated when he learned the truth. The man he had known as Emil Goldfus, the kind, quiet artist who discussed Cézanne and Rembrandt, had never existed. It was all performance. Every conversation, every shared lunch, every moment of friendship had been a lie. Or had it? In his final years, Abel painted constantly. The landscapes he created were beautiful, technically skilled, filled with the same care and attention he had shown in Brooklyn. Were they part of his cover, or were they something real, something human, something that transcended the role he had been assigned? We will never know. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of his story. Rudolf Abel was a master of his craft, but he paid a price. He lived his life in shadows, never fully himself, never fully anyone. He was a man without a country in the truest sense. Russian by birth, American by cover, Soviet by loyalty, but never quite belonging anywhere. When he died in 1971, obituaries in Western newspapers called him the Master Spy and the Ghost of Brooklyn. Soviet newspapers called him a hero, but no one could say with certainty who he really was. His story endures because it touches something fundamental about the human condition. We all wear masks to some degree. We all perform versions of ourselves depending on context. At work, at home, with friends, with strangers. But Abel took it further than most of us could imagine. He became his mask. He lived inside it so completely that the boundary between truth and fiction dissolved. And in the end, when he crossed that bridge in Berlin and returned to Moscow, did he feel relief? Or did he feel the strange emptiness of a man who had played a role for so long that he no longer remembered who he was supposed to be? The artist who never was. The spy who became a ghost. The man who never existed. In the shadowed world of espionage, perhaps that's exactly what he wanted. To be remembered not for who he was, but for who he pretended to be. To live on not as a person, but as a legend, a mystery, a name without a face. Rudolf Abel, William Fisher, Emil Goldfus, 3 names, 1 man, or perhaps no man at all. Just a shadow, moving through history, leaving behind only questions and the faint outline of a life that may never have been real.